granniopteryx, she knows the truth, she's linking every link.
Hello, I was sent this article by Potkin Azamir, with whom I have had a couple of conversations, and I hope to have many more with him. He's an extremely interesting chap, born in Iran, educated in England, and part of the backbone of the Iranian opposition to the reign of the mullahs, and extremely knowledgeable about Iran, but also about generally the Muslim wider world. And in this case, he sent me his article in an online publication called Focus on Western Islamism. And this one says, Nelson, that's a town, by the way, a hotbed of jihadism in northwest England. Nelson, by the way, just in case you're interested, is part of the Pennine countryscape that, it's called the backbone of England. Here, I'll find a map, just a minute. I had it here somewhere. Yeah. So these are the North Pennines, the Yorkshire Dales, the Fells, the South Pennine. This is where the Brontes lived, Peak District and the West Pennine Moors. Leeds is around here, and Manchester, Liverpool, they're around there. And they were separated by these rather formidable hills and mountains. It's an area that's about 500 million years old. It's very ancient and quite isolated in many cases. But then there was a canal built in the early 19th century between Leeds and Liverpool, and then later on in the 19th century there was a railway, and that really got this whole northern cloth industry going. The cotton arrived to Liverpool from America mostly, but also from India. It was processed and it was woven in Nelson a lot of the time. Also, Leeds, this area is not much good for growing stuff. High ground, windswept, but it's great for sheep. So the wool industry here was extremely strong, and the wool was turned into cloth or tailored up in Leeds. So there was an awful lot of industry going on here. And then in the just post-war, the very strong cotton industry in Nelson needed workers, and they brought them in from Pakistan, chiefly Kashmir and Mirpur, the places that appear to be causing trouble now, mostly for Muslim fundamentalism. And Nelson was one of the towns that took in a very large Muslim population. So that's how the Muslims got there. And they are living in this area which, if you look at the countryside, you could call it gentle, ancient countryside of industry that turned into an industrial area. And people tended to live in the valleys because there was a water supply there, of course, but also it was more sheltered by the surrounding hills, because the winds around there can get pretty rough, really. All right, so you see this typical industrial town sort of plan, rows and rows of terraced houses that grew up around this settlement of Nelson. By the way, it got its name from a pub, which is ironic considering the religious fundamentalism that's going on there now. There was a pub called the Admiral Nelson in that area, and it was very depopulated, but there was this pub there. And when the railway came across, they called it the Nelson, something like the Nelson stop, as opposed to the stop for the next town. I've forgotten the name of the next town, begins with an M, but that's not important. It was all part of that sort of general town, but then it got called the Nelson stop. And then people started building there, and and they stopped calling it the Nelson stop and just called it the Nelson. And after that, it became the town of Nelson. OK, right, that's as much as I remember. You know, I mean, it's in Lancashire. Hang on, let me get this straight. This is Yorkshire here. This is Lancashire on this side. And being a Yorkshire woman, I don't really like to talk too much about Lancashire, you know. Here, there's Leeds, there's Manchester, Blackpool. Hang on, let's get Liverpool. You know, this sort of area. That's all Lancashire, and this is all Yorkshire. All right, let's talk about Nelson now. It says here, a former mill town, once defined by looms, pubs and labour militancy. Of course, it had a very high industrial output there, mostly processing and weaving cotton for the domestic market. And then in the 1960s, the factories started to close down. The globalisation of the production of cloth just made it impossible to keep the looms going. It still has industries. It's gone more into other sorts of industries, diversified a bit, but the huge industrial base that it used to have has gone. So it means there will be a lot of people who aren't being employed in the factories and who are starting to think about religion instead, to take up the time. They're not working from 8 in the morning until 6 at night and then coming home just crashing out in front of the TV set. They have more time to think about, well, I'd say less constructive ideas, but that's just me. A former mill town in Lancashire has emerged as a recurring source of jihadist violence in Britain. Nelson, once known for its looms, pubs and labour militancy, has become an ideological incubator for Islamist extremism, producing multiple terrorists and exposing the consequences of long-ignored segregation and radicalisation in northwest England. Population of just 35,000, that's not very big. Nelson illustrates how even a small English town can become a persistent source of jihadist violence. The fact is that a few mosques established themselves with hotshot preachers who were funded by Saudi, I think, mostly, and definitely of a Deobandi persuasion. And they've been allowed to preach this stuff to their flock every Friday, and nobody has done anything about it. People like me and a Sargon of Akkad ages ago have been warning about this for years. But the establishment, and this includes the Conservatives as well as Labour, they just sort of sat back, it can never happen here type of thing. But it's worse in Labour towns because Labour really did, from the start, depend on the Muslim vote in those areas. So even when they could see things were getting bad, they didn't do anything. The Conservatives have very little presence there. So I can't blame them quite as much, but they were in government. They must have been getting information and they weren't doing anything about it either. Nelson's status as a hotbed of jihadism was cemented on October the 2nd when Jihad Ashami, a British citizen of Syrian descent, attacked Manchester's Heaton Park Hebrew Congregation Synagogue. He reportedly pledged allegiance to ISIS before he perpetrated an attack that resulted in the death of 2 synagogue members and injured 3 others. They don't mention the fact that one of the murdered people was actually killed by the police. We could say, the situation was chaotic and the police aren't to be held. Yes, they are to be held responsible. You don't shoot through a door. You have to know that most doors in Britain are not bulletproof. They were just badly trained. Just badly trained. That's it. I was going to say careless and all the rest of it. I don't know, just badly trained. And that's it. And that's Manchester police who are responsible for that. And who is ultimately responsible for Manchester police? Well, Andy Burnham, isn't it? The famous Andy Burnham, the pro-Palestinian Gaza genocide Andy Burnham. Investigators quickly traced Ashami's radicalisation back to Nelson, reporting that he had been attending Masjid Sunnah in 2022 and told one of his 3 wives that he really loved the mosque. Masjid Sunnah had drawn criticism for its imam, Abdul Abbas Navid, who linked the Gaza conflict to the plotting of the kuffar against Islam, a term denigrating all non-Muslims. So there we have the plotting of the kuffar against Islam. You see, much of Islam has this attitude that everyone's against them. I wonder why. It's a sort of feedback loop they have. They are quite violent to non-Muslims, and then they get quite upset that non-Muslims are suspicious of them. And so Abdul Abbas Navid said the Gaza conflict was part of the plot of the kuffar against Islam. So it's not just Jews. He will have drawn dots between Jews and Western leaders, and you know, when you're psychopathic, you can make all of these connections. So, yeah, again, as I've said before, it's not just the Jews. They're the obvious target right now, but they are not the end target. The end target is the entire Western world, and that's why I say it's handy to have Jews about in these islands, because they're the first flick of the barometer into stormy weather. The National Secular Society filed a complaint against the mosque, calling for its charitable status to be revoked. The Charity Commission issued formal guidance to the mosque's trustees. Oh yeah, here you are. Here's a list of instructions. You're going to stick to them, aren't you? Like good English gentlemen should. Yeah, that's the problem with the Charity Commission. Following complaints about these sermons. So the complaints actually would have come from local Muslims. You see, I am not saying that all Muslims are infected by this mind virus. There are many who are extremely sensible and happy in this little valley here in England, away from Pakistani factionalism and religious fundamentalism. They are happy. And when they hear this stuff at the mosque, they actually have informed people like the Charity Commission that there's some bad stuff going on there. So, yeah, don't blame all Muslims. What we've got to worry about is the fact that the government is not taking seriously what people like Raja Mir are warning us about. Okay. Following complaints about those sermons. You see, you wouldn't get non-Muslims in those sermons. Definitely Muslims or people who regularly pray in mosques. So fairly religious Muslims, they don't like it either. You know, you can make an argument for expelling all Muslims from this country because that will stop the problem. It won't, because there will be secret Muslims as well. So you can't do that. And when Nigel Farage said mass deportations are not possible, he had a point, although, there's a balance to be struck. Certainly people like that Abdul Abbas Navid should have been ejected from this country straight away. And I did hear of a case in France where a French, he was actually been in France for 30, 40 years or something, and he was from Tunisia or somewhere in North Africa, and he preached that the French flag was satanic and the French political system was nonsense. He was out the next day. They actually just picked him up and chucked him out. And that's what we should be doing here. But oh no, we're far too civilised and British for that, aren't we? We'll just give them some advice and then, of course, they'll do the right thing, won't they? Well, yeah. And that's the problem with the British. I think somebody said that the Hobbits were based on the British. You know, a calm, placid people who live in their valleys, do their farming, live quiet lives and think well of most until one of them has to go out and fight Mordor. And it's quite a valid idea, really. Anyway, such guidance appears to have had little effect with Naveed, who subsequently described Jews as treacherous. Right. Ash-Shami is not the first jihadist to emerge from Nelson, whose population is 55% Muslim. It's going to be a completely Muslim town pretty soon, isn't it? And there would be nothing wrong with that if the Muslims were subscribing to what is broadly known as British values. I don't know that they're British values now, it's Western values. It's rule of law, property rights, and not stealing things, and not trying to force their religion on other people. That's the strength and the weakness of the Church of England. At the moment, it's the weakness. But it was part of the genteel idea. There were many people who call themselves Christians, who belong to the Church of England, who were perfectly beastly within their minds about black people or Jews or Pakistanis, but they kept it quiet. They didn't try and force it on anyone else. Now, a lot of, say, French people would refer to this as hypocrisy. Most British people would regard this as just being civilised and getting along with people you don't like simply because we're all sharing the same space. Such guidance, right. So here we have 55% Muslim. Another Nelson resident, Mohammed Bilal, was charged in February this year with 6 terrorism-related offences. A few months later, he pleaded guilty to planning a gun attack and travelling to Somalia. Well, I don't know why we just don't send him to Somalia anyway. In 2018, Hussein Rashid, from Nelson and an Islamic State supporter, was jailed for life. Minimum of 19 years for running an online channel named Lone Mujahid, and provided an e-toolkit for terrorism. Rashid encouraged lone wolf attackers to engage in indiscriminate violence at public venues, football stadiums, and to target Prince George IV at his primary school. Oh yeah, getting at infants. That is something that jihadis seem to prefer doing. And again, you see, jihadists who kill school children. There was an instance where a couple of jihadists got into a school in Israel, and a nursery school, and they killed the. I don't know. I have a vague memory of this. Like I'm sure the Israelis who are watching this have more than a vague memory. It was like children under the age of 7 or 8, I think, all from babyhood up. And they just kill these kids and their teachers, I suppose. Well, whatever. Later on, there were Muslims talking about it, and they called these guys great heroes. Now, that isn't what any of us here in the UK, in British culture, would regard as great heroes. No, there used to be a thing about not fighting people who were wearing glasses. Yeah? It was part of the idea of a British fairness that if you're going to have a fight, you should be on a level. And so if somebody is wearing glasses, it means they can't see so well. So you shouldn't take advantage of that. If they can see well enough without their glasses, then they have to take their glasses off first. So you're not pushing glass into their faces in a fight. You're not damaging their glasses, which are expensive. I mean, this was one of those things that became something you didn't even think about. It was part of this fairness idea. But jihadists don't have that idea. In fact, most of the Muslim world doesn't have it. I've mentioned this before. Bullying, what we would call bullying, is just considered the way things should be in most Muslim societies, which is why they don't progress that well. By the way, it's one of the reasons. I mean, it's the idea of British fairness which has propelled the West into the future that we have in our grasp if we don't allow Islam to drag us back. His sentence was reduced after appeal. According to the BBC, no great opponents of Islam, Rashid suggested injecting poison into supermarket ice creams and bringing down aircraft using lasers. The inventiveness of evil, it's just astonishing, isn't it? In 2019, Victoria Layla Webster pleaded guilty, she was in Nelson too, of 2 counts of providing money for purpose of terrorism and 1 count of inviting another defendant, a former girlfriend of a footballer, to provide money for purposes of terrorism. I don't remember hearing about Victoria Layla Webster, but it looks like she's a convert, which means that your brain can be turned even after you've been brought up in what I called British values of fairness. Clearly, Islamism is taking root in Nelson and Nelson and the surrounding Lancashire county, where 18-year-old Maheen Kamran was elected as a pro-Gaza councillor in May 2025. Kamran publicly called for gender segregation, and this, of course, is in direct conflict with British equality law, etc. And so it says that Nelson has a history of communism. And it's sort of interesting, isn't it? You know, the horseshoe theory that I don't think it's horseshoe, because horseshoe has a gap at one end. I think it's just a circle. You get communism on one side. I'm showing my left. That's your left, isn't it? OK, there's a communism on one side and Islamism on the other. And as they get more fanatical, they just meet in the middle. And so the atmosphere of communism, which is against Western liberal values, and Islamism, they were right there being planted in this pleasant valley. OK. Nelson's case should not be dismissed as an isolated anomaly. No, it's probably, what you call it, a bellwether. It's probably the first sign of stuff starting all over the place. You know, I keep talking about chickenpox. In chickenpox, it starts, you see just one spot. And then suddenly, ping, 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 the kid's covered in them. Let's see, it's the foreseeable outcome of official neglect. After the London Bridge attack that cost 8 people their lives, Prime Minister Theresa May acknowledged that Britain had shown far too much tolerance of extremism. So, words. She said words. Was anything done about it? You tell me. At Manchester Heaton Synagogue. Yep. That's how many years later? Nearly a decade later, those conversations remain largely unspoken, deferred in favour of managerial complacency and political risk avoidance. I cannot argue with any of those words there. Nelson demonstrates the cost of that failure. Now, you may know that quite close to Nelson, this is Dalton in Cumbria. You see more Pleasant Valley here, and that's where Dalton is, which is quite close to this area where Nelson is. And there is a super mosque being built there, a huge Islamic complex, huge and absolutely out of place in this part of the world. But you can see how there's going to be a sort of takeover of this area, which is strengthening itself. The people are moving out of there now. They're frightened, and they should be. OK, reclaiming towns like Nelson will require the state to abandon its reluctance to act, enforcing the law evenly, confronting ideological radicalisation directly, and ending the pretence that social cohesion can be achieved without challenging those who actively undermine it. And this is Potkin's article here. Here's Potkin. OK, he's warning us. I'm taking that warning on. I don't think that mosque should be being built in Dalton. I think a lot of this stuff here in Nelson can be split up. The radical preachers can be removed. They should be removed. They're preaching nothing but evil and Islamic supremacy and takeover of the West. They're certainly going to be taking over that whole part of British countryside. This is Dalton here. So it's over there, and Nelson is around here. So you can see what's happening with this area. This is an area of astonishing ancient beauty. And it looks like there's a sort of concerted effort to establish an Islamic state in this area. And maybe I'm overstating the case here. But it could. There's no way of saying it can't happen here, because it happened in Afghanistan. It happened in what we now call Pakistan, in the hills of Pakistan. Afghanistan used to be a Buddhist country, you know. All right, well, yeah, I think enough of that. Till next time. You can help my channel by subscribing and clicking the notification bell. That's quite important. And by sharing if you're so inclined. Links to my other channels and to donation methods are in the description. But the best way you can help is simply by clicking like and notify. Thank you.